Mark's backyard was his sanctuary. Nestled behind his modest suburban home, the neatly stacked firewood was more than just fuel for the cold months ahead. It was a symbol of his hard work and peace of mind. Every log was carefully cut, dried, and arranged like a fortress against winter's chill. But recently, that fortress had begun to crumble in the most unexpected way. It started with a nagging feeling, an itch at the back of Mark's mind that something wasn't right. When he went out one morning to gather kindling for his breakfast fire, he noticed the stack seemed smaller. A few logs missing. Maybe I miscounted, he thought. But over the next week, the losses continued. More logs vanished without explanation. Mark's unease grew. He checked for any sign of natural causes. Dampness, rot, or animals. But the wood was pristine, and no one in his family had touched it. So who could it be, and why? His heart began to pound on a chilly Thursday evening when he spotted a shadow moving near the edge of his yard. The moon hung low and full, casting long, eerie shapes on the pavement. The shadow was quick but deliberate. Someone prowling close to his precious firewood pile. Mark's breath caught in his throat as he crept closer, careful not to alert the figure. His pulse raced, every nerve sharp with adrenaline. The figure crouched low, hands working quickly, pulling logs apart and slipping them into a worn canvas bag. Karen. He recognized her immediately. The notorious HOA, Karen, as neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Known for her sharp tongue and obsession with order, she wielded the HOA rules like a weapon, often turning neighbors against each other with petty complaints and harsh demands. She was the self-appointed queen of the cul-de-sac, and Mark's best guess was that she had no respect for anyone's property, especially his. As Mark watched, hidden in the shadows behind the thick hedge, Karen muttered under her breath, "This neighborhood needs to look perfect. Those logs are just clutter." She tossed another log into her bag and straightened up, scanning the quiet street with a suspicious glance before slipping away like a ghost. Mark's fists clenched. He wanted to shout, to storm over and demand an explanation, but something held him back. If Karen wanted a fight, she was sure to make it ugly. Better to wait and gather evidence. He vowed silently that this wouldn't end quietly. The next day, whispers of Karen's reputation filled the air like a thick fog. Stories of her demanding letters, strange inspections, and relentless patrols of the neighborhood circulated amongst the residents. Some feared her, others avoided her, but no one had ever caught her stealing. Until now. Mark's curiosity morphed into determination. He began watching his yard with renewed vigilance, setting small traps of his own. Strategically, placed twigs and leaves to show any disturbance. Every creak and rustle in the night made his heart leap, but Karen was clever. For days, the firewood disappeared in smaller amounts, stealthily enough to confuse and frustrate Mark. The neighborhood tension thickened. Neighbors exchanged glances and half smiles when they saw Karen strolling by, as if they knew something but dared not say it aloud. Mark felt like a man in a thriller, a lone guardian defending his fortress against an invisible enemy. The stolen wood wasn't just material loss. It was a challenge, a violation of trust. Who else would steal like this in a place meant for safety and community? The air hung heavy with suspense. Mark knew this wasn't just about firewood anymore. It was about standing up, about sending a message that boundaries mattered. But how far was he willing to go? And what if Karen's next move was more dangerous than he imagined? As night fell again, Mark stepped outside, eyes scanning the dark edges of his yard. Somewhere out there, in the cold silence, the thief was waiting, or maybe planning her next strike. The game had begun. Mark's nerves were stretched tight like a violin string as night fell over the neighborhood once more. He had barely slept, haunted by the shadow of Karen creeping around his backyard. This time, he was determined not to be a passive victim. If she wanted to play the thief, he would play the vigilant watchman. He stationed himself behind the thick hedge near the firewood pile, his breath visible in the cool night air. The streetlights cast long pools of yellow light, but his yard lay mostly in darkness. Perfect for hiding, yet treacherous for any misstep. His eyes scanned every inch, every flicker of movement. Minutes felt like hours. Then, just as he began to question whether he was imagining things, a quiet rustle broke the silence. There she was. Karen moved with practiced stealth, her silhouette outlined against the dim glow of a nearby porch light. She wore gloves, and her face was set in that cold, determined expression Mark had come to loathe. The canvas bag swung loosely from her shoulder, ready to be filled. Mark's heart hammered as she approached the firewood pile. Crouching low to avoid any streetlight, the wood, stacked like a fortress just days before, suddenly seemed fragile and vulnerable. Karen's fingers worked quickly, almost reverently, pulling out a log and slipping it into the bag. "You can't keep doing this," Mark whispered to himself, barely daring to breathe. But she was oblivious to his presence, absorbed in her mission, a mission she justified under the guise of community betterment. Mark remembered her HOA speeches. Clutter like that is an eyesore. It's for everyone's good. Yet stealing, that was crossing a line. Karen paused, glancing over her shoulder as if sensing a presence. Mark froze, heart in his throat. She looked down the street, then back at the pile, apparently reassured. The tension in the air was suffocating. Mark decided it was time to confront her. He stepped out from behind the hedge, his voice low but firm. "Karen, what do you think you're doing?" Karen jerked, nearly dropping a log. Her eyes narrowed with cold fury. "Mark," she said, dripping with sarcasm, "I'm making sure this neighborhood stays presentable. These logs are just trash." "Trash. They're my property," Mark said, stepping closer, the weight of frustration making his voice shake. "You don't get to just take what you want," Karen scoffed, brushing a strand of hair back. "The HOA rules don't exactly say private firewood," she snapped. "You're lucky I'm not calling the board on you for having this pile here in the first place." Mark's jaw tightened. This wasn't just about wood anymore. It was about power. Karen's power to intimidate and control. But he wouldn't let her win. Before the confrontation could escalate, Karen slammed the canvas bag shut and started walking away, muttering, "You'll regret this." Her footsteps echoed in the quiet street, a warning that the war had only just begun. Mark watched her retreat, the adrenaline slowly ebbing. His mind raced. How could he stop her without causing a neighborhood uproar? He needed a plan, something clever, something that would protect his property and send a clear message, without igniting a full-blown HOA battle. Neighbors peeked from their windows, sensing the tension, but afraid to intervene. Mark realized he was alone in this fight, and the stakes felt higher than ever. Each stolen log was not just wood. It was a symbol of Karen's creeping control over the neighborhood's peace and respect. As Mark closed the door behind him, that night, he couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was watching him too, waiting for her next chance to strike, and he needed to be ready. The game was no longer about firewood. It was about standing ground. The next HOA meeting was already scheduled, and the entire neighborhood seemed to buzz with anticipation. Mark felt the weight of everyone's unspoken expectations. Would he finally confront Karen publicly? Or would the tension explode behind closed doors? As Mark walked into the small community centre, he noticed the usual crowd, the gossipy Mrs. Patel whispering near the coffee table, the nervous Mr. Jenkins clutching his notes, and of course, Karen, perched at the far end of the room like a queen surveying her domain. Her eyes locked onto Mark the moment he entered, a slow, cold smile spreading across her face. When the meeting began, routine matters were quickly discussed. Landscaping guidelines, parking rules, upcoming events. But Mark's heart pounded beneath the polite chatter. Finally, when the floor opened for new business, Mark stood up. "This is about something important," he said, his voice steady but firm. "My firewood has been disappearing for weeks. I believe it's been taken without permission." His eyes locked onto Karen's, who stiffened but said nothing. The room went silent. Karen's response came sharp and quick. "Mark, those logs are an eyesore and violate HOA rules. If anyone should be concerned, it's the community. I'm simply protecting our neighborhood's appearance." Mark's jaw tightened. "Stealing my firewood isn't protecting anything. It's theft. Property rights matter here." Karen scoffed, standing abruptly. "You think you're the only one who has rules to follow. The HOA exists for everyone's benefit. Maybe if you kept your yard tidy, we wouldn't have this problem." Murmurs rose around the room. Some nodded in agreement, others looked uncomfortable. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mark pressed on. "This isn't just about aesthetics. It's about respect. I worked hard for that wood, and taking it without permission is wrong." Karen's voice dropped into a sneer. "Respect? Maybe you should learn what that means in this community. Your pile was a hazard and an eyesore. If I'm the bad guy for wanting our neighborhood to look its best, so be it." The HOA president, trying to maintain order, stepped in. "Let's keep this civil. Mark, have you reported this to the board before? Karen, can we find a compromise?" Mark shook his head. "I haven't reported it because I hope to solve this neighborly, but I won't stand for theft." Karen smirked. "Then maybe you're the one who needs to solve your own problems." The room erupted into whispers and sideways glances. The confrontation felt like a powder keg, ready to explode, and everyone sensed it could spiral beyond HOA politics. Mark left the meeting feeling a mix of frustration and determination. Karen wasn't just a petty thief. She was a formidable opponent, armed with HOA rules and a ruthless will. The neighborhood was divided, and Mark was on the front lines. Back home, Mark stared at his dwindling firewood pile, feeling the sting of injustice sharpen. He knew direct confrontation wouldn't work. Karen thrived on conflict and control. She needed to be outsmarted. As he paced his yard, a spark of an idea ignited. What if he could protect his wood in a way Karen couldn't ignore? A deterrent, so clever it would force her to think twice. Something unconventional. Something with teeth. The buzzing sound of bees drifted into his mind. A curious protective force in nature. Mark remembered a story he'd heard about ancient guardians, using bees to protect treasures. Could he bring that legend to life? His pulse quickened as he imagined his firewood guarded not by fences or locks, but by a natural army. It was risky, maybe even a little wild, but it just might work. The war wasn't over. It was about to get a lot more interesting. Mark lay awake that night, the glow of his phone screen casting a pale light in the dark room. He scoured forums, articles, and local beekeeper websites, his mind racing faster than his heartbeat. The idea that had struck him in the meeting was growing into something tangible and daring. Bees. It sounded crazy at first. Who would protect firewood with bees? But the more he read, the more it made sense. Bees were fiercely territorial, protective of their hive. They didn't attack without cause. but if disturbed, their defense was swift and painful. If Mark could, somehow, hide beehives inside his firewood stacks, Karen's pilfering days would be over. And with a sting, he imagined the scene already. Karen, unsuspecting, reaching into the woodpile, only to be swarmed by angry bees. It was poetic justice, nature's own defense system, delivering the message Karen refused to hear. But Mark also knew the risks. Bees were living creatures, not weapons. He had to be careful to keep them safe and prevent harm to innocent neighbors or himself. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about deterrence, about reclaiming his peace. The next day, Mark called a local beekeeper named Mrs. Ellis, a warm but no-nonsense woman who specialized in urban beekeeping. He explained his situation carefully, omitting the theft details, but emphasizing his need for discreet protection. "I think bees could be just the guardians you need," Mrs. Ellis said thoughtfully. "But you have to promise me this. The bees come first. No harm to them, and no reckless moves. If you do this right, it can work. But if you scare the neighborhood or harm the bees, you'll be in hot water." Mark agreed immediately. He felt a strange kinship with these tiny warriors. They would guard his firewood like soldiers defending their queen. That weekend, under the cover of early morning mist, Mark and Mrs. Ellis arrived at his home with several carefully contained hives. The beekeeper worked expertly, placing each hive inside the hollow sections of the firewood stack, camouflaged behind logs and hidden in plain sight. The bees hummed softly, a living, breathing force nestled inside the woodpile. Mark felt a thrill of excitement and anxiety. The buzzing was faint but unmistakable, a promise of protection, warning, and power. Neighbors passing by would hear the soft drone and feel a strange curiosity. A few glanced at the pile suspiciously, wondering what was different this time. But Mark said nothing, keeping his secret close. Days passed, and the bees settled into their new home. Mark checked regularly, making sure they were healthy and calm. He imagined Karen prowling nearby, oblivious to the natural sentinels waiting just beneath the surface. But the suspense gnawed at him. What if Karen noticed? What if she tried to steal again, unaware of the sting that awaited? Mark couldn't predict the outcome, but one thing was certain. He was no longer defenseless. He had turned the tables with a clever, almost poetic weapon. The bees were his allies now, guardians of his peace and property. As twilight deepened and the neighborhood settled into quiet, Mark's gaze lingered on the firewood pile. The soft buzzing beneath the logs was a comforting sound, a promise that his quiet war had entered a new and dangerous phase. The question hung heavy in the air. Would Karen take the bait? And if she did, would she finally learn her lesson? Or would the next move be even more explosive? Mark didn't know, but he was ready to find out. Days slipped by with a quiet hum. Literally, Mark's hidden bees remained calm, nestled safely inside the firewood, their presence invisible to the casual observer. But to Mark, every faint buzz was a reminder of the looming threat beneath the surface, waiting patiently for the inevitable. At first, life seemed to return to normal. Karen made no sign of returning to the firewood pile, and the neighborhood carried on with its usual rhythms. Yet, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was brewing, a storm just beneath the calm. His neighbors noticed the subtle change too. Some glanced curiously at the humming woodpile, whispering about the strange buzzing noises. Mrs. Patel, ever the busybody, peered over the fence with a puzzled frown. But Mark kept his secret close, watching silently as tension curled like smoke in the air. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark spotted movement. From behind the corner of his garage, Karen appeared, moving cautiously, but with a determined edge. Her eyes scanned the yard, sharp and suspicious. Mark's heart thudded painfully in his chest. Was she here to steal again? Or had she sensed something strange and was investigating? Karen approached the firewood pile slowly, her footsteps light but deliberate. Mark held his breath behind the fence, watching as she reached toward the logs. The soft buzzing seemed to grow louder in his ears. For a moment, Karen hesitated, her hand hovering inches above the wood. Then she shook her head, muttering to herself about paranoia or imagination. But Mark noticed something new. Her eyes flicked repeatedly toward the pile, wary, almost afraid. The suspense tightened its grip. Had Karen heard the bees? Could she sense the hidden danger? Mark felt a thrill mixed with dread. The trap was set, but he had no idea if she would take it. Over the next days, Karen's behavior shifted. She prowled the neighborhood with more caution, watching Mark's yard from a distance. Always alert, as if expecting the unexpected. Rumors swirled that she was complaining to the HOA about strange noises and dangerous wildlife. Mark's friends warned him, "Be careful, you don't want to start a war you can't control." But Mark was determined. This was about standing up for himself and setting boundaries. He wasn't going to back down, not now. One afternoon, as Mark was checking on the bees, he heard a sudden commotion from across the street. Neighbors rushed outside, voices raised in alarm. Mark's heart leapt. Could it be? He ran over to see Karen, her face flushed and the eyes wild, backing away from his yard, swatting frantically at her arms. Small red welts bloomed on her skin. "Got stung!" Someone gasped. What happened? Mark's pulse surged. His plan had worked, but the moment was charged with danger. The bees had defended their territory fiercely, and Karen had paid the price. But the question lingered. Would Karen learn from this? Or would she strike back, vowing revenge? As Karen disappeared into her house, nursing her stings and fury, Mark knew the neighborhood had changed. The quiet war had erupted into something real and undeniable. Neighbors now watched his firewood pile with a mixture of fear and fascination. The bees had become both guardians and symbols of defiance. Mark returned home, his thoughts swirling. The bees were his allies, but this was just the beginning. Karen wouldn't give up easily. The stakes were higher, and the next chapter of their conflict promised to be even more explosive. After Karen's painful encounter with the bees, the neighborhood was buzzing with rumors. Some whispered praise for Mark's cleverness. Others feared the escalating feud might spiral out of control. The subtle peace of the cul-de-sac had shattered, replaced by a simmering tension that everyone could feel. Mark kept a low profile, checking on the bees daily and reinforcing his hidden defenses. The firewood pile hummed softly, a constant reminder of the invisible army guarding his property. But he knew Karen was far from done. One afternoon, Mark noticed strange activity around his yard. Neighbors who rarely spoke were exchanging nervous glances and hushed conversations. Flyers appeared on windshields, warning about dangerous bees and safety hazards, signed anonymously but clearly targeting him. Then came the notices. From the HOA, the board claimed complaints had been filed about Mark's unauthorized beekeeping and demanded immediate removal of the hives. The language was polite but firm. No compromises. Mark's jaw clenched. This was Karen's doing, no doubt. She was using every tool at her disposal to force him to back down. But Mark wasn't about to surrender. That evening, Mark decided to hold a neighborhood meeting outside, under the fading light. He wanted to clear the air, explain the bees, and maybe, just maybe, regain some trust. As neighbors gathered hesitantly, Mark stood before them and spoke calmly. I know there's been a lot of concern about the bees. I want to assure you, they're not a threat to anyone who respects this neighborhood. They're here to protect my property, because frankly, I was being stolen from. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded. Others crossed their arms, skeptically. Karen arrived late, arms folded, eyes sharp. This is ridiculous, she snapped. You're putting us all at risk. What if a child gets stung? This isn't some backyard experiment. Mark met her gaze steadily. I understand the concern, Karen. But these bees are well cared for and monitored. They only sting when provoked. This is about respect for property and neighbors. The crowd split between support and doubt. The tension was palpable. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from Mark's backyard. Everyone turned toward the noise. Karen had stormed to the firewood pile, yanked a log free, and instantly, a furious swarm of bees erupted. Screams and frantic swatting filled the air as the bees took to the attack. Mark moved quickly, guiding neighbors to safety and calling Mrs. Ellis to help calm the swarm. The chaotic scene was a stark reminder of how volatile the situation had become. Once the bees settled, Karen retreated inside, nursing fresh stings and seething with rage. But the damage was done. The neighborhood had witnessed the power of nature's defense. In the days that followed, Mark received a surprising message. The HOA board was reconsidering the beekeeping ban. Influenced by neighbors who admired his ingenuity and respected his rights. Yet, Karen remained a formidable force, vowing to challenge any decision that favored him. Mark realized the battle lines had been drawn. This wasn't just about firewood or bees anymore. It was about standing up to control, reclaiming respect, and protecting his home at any cost. As he gazed at the humming woodpile one evening, Mark knew the conflict was far from over. But now, he wasn't just defending logs. He was defending his right to live on his own terms. The bees hummed softly, ready for whatever came next. The neighborhood had never felt so charged with tension. Mark's firewood pile, once a simple stack of logs, had become a battleground. A symbol of rebellion and resilience. The bees hummed steadily, their presence both a warning and a shield, while Karen's bitterness deepened into something sharper, darker. Days after the chaotic swarm attack, Mark noticed a new pattern of disturbances. Strange footprints appeared near his yard at night, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. Someone was trying to intimidate him. Or worse. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Mark heard a faint scratching near the fence. He grabbed a flashlight and crept outside. Peering through the shadows, he spotted Karen, crouched low, holding a small canister. Her face was twisted with grim determination. "What are you doing?" Mark called out, stepping forward. Karen froze, then snapped. "You think this ends with bees? I'm done playing nice." Mark's pulse raced. "You can't burn my firewood." Karen's lips curled in a bitter smile. "I don't need to. I just need to make sure your precious bees don't survive the night." Before Mark could react, she tossed the canister near the pile. A faint hiss escaped as flames flickered to life. The firewood ignited quickly, the dry wood crackling and popping as the fire spread. Mark lunged forward, dousing the flames with water from his hose. The bees, startled and frantic, swarmed protectively around their hives, their buzzing turning frantic. Neighbors poured out of their houses, drawn by the smoke and shouts. Some called the fire department. Others stared in shock. Karen stood back, arms crossed, watching the destruction with cold satisfaction. "Maybe now you'll think twice before defying the rules." But Mark wasn't finished. As the fire department arrived and extinguished the blaze, he turned to Karen with quiet resolve. This isn't over. The fire had damaged some of the hives, but thanks to Mrs. Ellis's care and Mark's quick action, most of the bees survived. Still, the attack marked a dangerous escalation. The neighborhood divided further. Some sympathized with Karen's desire for order. Others feared her growing aggression. Mark found unexpected allies among neighbors who had silently supported him all along, ready to stand up against Karen's reign. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Mark presented his case with calm, undeniable evidence of Karen's sabotage and intimidation. The board voted, finally siding with Mark's right to protect his property and keep the bees. Karen stormed out, vowing revenge in hushed threats. That night, as Mark sat by the firewood pile, the bees buzzed softly in the darkness. He felt a fierce pride, but also a cautious wariness. The battle had been won, but the war, and Karen's vendetta, might last much longer. Suddenly, a soft buzzing began nearby, but it wasn't the bees. Mark turned sharply, eyes narrowing, in the shadows. A new presence was in the neighborhood, one no one had expected. The night hung heavy with tension, the kind that prickled at the back of Mark's neck, like the faint hum of distant bees. But this wasn't the familiar drone from his firewood pile. Something else was buzzing. Closer, stranger. Mark's eyes scanned the shadows beyond his yard. From the darkness, a figure emerged, moving with quiet purpose. "Who's there?" Mark called, stepping forward cautiously. The figure stepped into the light of a street lamp. A man, tall and calm, with a kind but determined gaze. He held a small box, delicate but clearly important. "I'm David," the man said softly. "I heard about what's been happening here, about your bees." And Karen. Mark's surprise was immediate. "How do you know?" David smiled faintly. "I'm a beekeeper too, but more than that, I'm a mediator for neighborhood disputes involving unusual problems. I help people find solutions when things get out of hand." Mark felt a flicker of hope. Could this stranger be the unexpected ally he needed? David continued. "Karen's actions have caused fear, yes. But I believe there's a way to end this. Not with fights or threats, but with understanding and respect. If you're willing, I can help set up a community meeting. One that includes education about bees and safety, so neighbors can see the truth." Mark hesitated, the long battle weighing on him. Could this work? Could Karen be reasoned with? He nodded slowly. "I'm willing." Over the next few days, David worked tirelessly. He organized a neighborhood event in the park, inviting everyone, including Karen, to learn about bees, their role in nature, and how Mark had used them to protect his property responsibly. The turnout was better than expected. Children watched the gentle bees with fascination. Adults asked questions and voiced concerns. David's calm explanations eased fears and opened minds. Karen arrived reluctantly, arms crossed but curious. When David invited her to observe the hives safely, she hesitated, then stepped forward. Watching the bees in action, Karen's stern expression softened. She admitted quietly, "I didn't understand. I thought the bees were a danger." Mark took a deep breath. "They're not just protecting my wood. They're part of the neighborhood's health. We just need to respect their space." The community began to shift. The HOA lifted its ban on the hives, establishing guidelines for safe beekeeping. Karen, surprisingly, agreed to help enforce the rules, showing a new side of herself. But the biggest surprise came a week later. Mark discovered a note slipped under his door. It was unsigned but heartfelt. Thank you for standing your ground. Your bees reminded me that respect isn't about control. It's about coexistence. Sorry for the trouble. A neighbor, Mark smiled, realizing that sometimes the fiercest battles yield the deepest lessons. As he looked at his now peaceful firewood pile, the bees buzzing softly inside, Mark felt a quiet victory, not just over Karen, but over fear, misunderstanding, and division. The neighborhood wasn't perfect. There would always be challenges, but with patience, courage, and a little help from nature's tiniest warriors, peace had finally found a home. And somewhere, in the hum of those busy bees, Mark knew the story wasn't just about stolen firewood. It was about standing up, thinking differently, and discovering unexpected allies in the unlikeliest places.